Andrei Soldatov, you and Irina Borogan, your partner in life and journalism, are two of the most respected experts on Russian secret services. Your latest book is The Compatriots, the brutal and chaotic history of Russia's exils, emigres, and agents abroad. This year, the Romanian version was published at Omnium Publishing House. It was said that you have thus completed a perfect trilogy with two previous books, The New Nobility, which describes how secret services captured the Russian state under Putin, and The Red Web, which looks into the Kremlin's attempt to control the internet. This last book covers a century of clandestine operations, active measures, and political assassinations conducted both by and against Russians who either are refugees in the West or were sent there as Kremlin's agents. We will talk about this book, the Russia's war against Ukraine, the Russian secret services, and your personal destiny. So this book started with three personal stories after the Bolshevik Revolution. Zarubin, Eitingon, and Gorskaya, a disciplined Russian, a resourceful and ruthless Jew, and the Romanian, well-educated, fierce cosmopolitan woman would become highly successful Soviet agents. All three would help define and execute the Kremlin's strategy regarding the threat posed by Russians across the borders. Why did you choose these three characters to tell the story of the beginnings?
First of all, thank you for having me and for this opportunity to talk about these very important topics. Well, we choose these three characters because first of all, we wanted to tell and to explain why and what we can understand about the present modern Russian security services, about what they do now, looking into their past. And it is, unfortunately, one of the many signs of Putin's Russia that, especially espionage agencies, they haven't changed much from their Soviet predecessors. So you can several ways how to tell this story. You can try to explain things using an academic approach, talking about institutions and organizations and textbooks, terminology, but it is not extremely interesting for the general audience. And you also can tell this story while talking about people, their lives, especially if you have some characters who have had a really long careers in Russian security and Soviet security services, starting from 1920s and until up to 1960s, in some cases 1980s. And if you have several generations, and that is the case with these characters. So we have several generations, and some of the descendants of these characters are very much active today in today's Russia.
Really?
Many of them
one century after that, there are still descendants that are working in the same the secret services intelligence?
No, they're not working in the security services, but we have one guy who made his career as a very successful Russian banker, thanks to his connections, his family connections to the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency. So he was helped by his grandmother, actually, and she helped him, she introduced him to the right people. And in the 1990s, many things, and especially with the Russian banks, about your connections with the security services. And the foreign intelligence played a really huge role and because they have the best and the brightest people. So he made his career as a very successful businessman because of that. But things changed under Putin, and well, we all know now that Putin is extremely I would say ruthless and paranoid, and the system he created doesn't give guarantees to anyone, even if you have really high connections. So this guy ended up in jail, was released, and he is actually on the good side. So he's one of the Russian emigres, and he is helping Russian human rights. But still, his family and his ideas, how these ideas defined his mentality. You can trace it back to the beginning of the 20th century.
What were your sources? We know that the archives of the intelligence services are not opened until after decades later, if they are open at all, and the Russian ones are among the most inaccessible. So how did you have access to the files of some of the most important Soviet and Russian spies?
Well, we are, Irina and I, we are both investigative journalists, and we've been writing about this topic for more than 20 years. So over this period of time, and we started back in 1999, we developed some good sources inside. So we rely to some part on the archives, but as journalists, we believe that the most important part is to talk to people. So we talk to people, and we got access to some family histories, to some family archives, family memoirs. So there are some books which were published only for family use, actually, by these characters, with some incredible photographs, incredible recollections of some very interesting events, which has, well, quite a crucial place in the Russian and Soviet history. So when you have this kind of access, you can understand what make people tick, why they do what they do.
Those who were recruited to become Soviet spies were bound by the idea of a global revolution, as you wrote in the book. But what about now, in the last 30 years? What are the reasons why Russian immigrants choose to work for Putin? Does the Kremlin or Lubyanka still have an ideology to attract them, or is it just money or the power, or maybe they are frustrated about their homeland, or patriots toward the motherland?
Yes, it's a very, very good question. And that is why we chose these characters, because what we wanted to show is that the Soviet and Russian intelligence is always about two parts. So you, on the one hand, you have this legacy of people who were driven by ideology. And that is why we chose this Romanian Jew, because she actually believed in the idea of communism, and she was extremely global. She spoke many languages, extremely well educated, intelligent, worldly. On the other hand, Zarubin, with his Russian name, he represents for us a second phase of the Russian intelligence. Very brutal, very nationalistic, with the idea that everything should be under control. And many, I would say that the Soviet intelligence got many successes, especially between the wars, thanks to the first category of people who are really globalized, because we believed not in the idea of Russia, but we believed in the idea of communism. And it was easier to recruit people for the communist cause than to recruit them, say, to spy and to help the Soviet Russia. I mean, when you spy for an idea, you do not feel yourself a traitor, because it's not about the country, it's about the world. But if you're recruited only to spy for Russia, well, it makes things much more difficult. But what happened already in the middle of the Second World War, that Stalin, who was always paranoid, became even more paranoid. So he decided to get rid of this first category of people and to rely exclusively on this Russian personnel, who were, as I said, extremely brutal, nationalistic, and narrow-minded. And on the way, they destroyed many things built by the first category. And that is why after the war, the Soviet intelligence was not that successful as what before the Second World War. What we see now is Russia doesn't have, of course, the ideology which would have the equal appeal to the world as it was like in the 1930s. At the same time, you still have people who feel either really angry about what is going on in the world, and they believe that Russia, especially Putin, presents some sort of alternative, and these people might be approached. But on the other hand, what we also try to show in the book that from the very beginning, the Soviet intelligence counted on its influence among the Russian emigres. And we are talking about all these generations, starting from people who fled from the Tsar, because people started fleeing the country long before the revolution and never stopped. And we see now, again, a very big wave of immigration. The problem is that the Soviet intelligence and the Russian intelligence now knows how to talk to these people, and sometimes in a very brutal way. Lots of these people, they had their relatives left in the country. So people like Zarubin and his friends could have easily approached these emigres, telling them, look, you still have family in the Soviet Union. Well, we can get them in jail very easily. So please, that's your choice. And that is exactly what is going on right now. We already see that the Russian security services now, during the time of the war in Ukraine, they started approaching families of the recent emigres, of people who left because of the war. And we already have several examples, and thanks to lawyers we know about these cases, that people were approached, I mean families of emigres were approached by the FSB and asked to talk to their relatives and all of that. So we see that these tactics, these methods, they never go away.
You have some wonderful stories there and focused especially on the United States. For instance, the assassination of Trotsky in 1940, the direct order of Stalin. And this is easily a scenario for a blockbuster there. And speaking about what happened after the 1990s, for example, the descendants of the white Russians who fled to United States from Russia and gave Putin the Russian white church willingly, So for these people who believe, does these people believe in the world of Putin as he is presented, the alternative world constructed by disinformation and so on? Why these brilliant people choose to work for Putin?
Well, I would say they are not, mostly they are not ideological. They're extremely cynical. So people you're talking about, like Boris Jordan, who has this Russian-American background, and he is a direct descendant to the family of Russian aristocratic immigration right after the revolution. Yes, he decided to get back to Russia, not back, but to go to Russia in the early 1990s, because he was not that successful in the United States. And he identified very early that Russia of the 1990s presented a great opportunity to make money. And for 10 years, for 8 years, that was what he was doing, making money. He was not really political. Yes, his father wanted to invest in some activities in Russia, sort of promoting the memory of the White Guard. But for his son, it was just a hobby, I would say, not a big deal. But after that, we got Putin, and Putin became really interested almost immediately after he came to power at taking control, I would say that, of the Russian immigration in Europe and in the United States. So he started talking to these people, and that presented an opportunity for people like Jordan. If you have a leader of the country who is so interested in this topic, and you have something to sell, and the Jordans they had something to sell, they influence among the Russian community. That's exactly what we did. They decided to cooperate and to help Putin. They suffered also a lot because Putin was always very ruthless. So he never his way of dealing with mistakes made by others is very brutal. But nevertheless, until now, already after the annexation of Crimea, these people were extremely supportive of Putin, and they tried to whitewash his reputation in the West using all their connections, their influence, their money, which was a big surprise to us, because we always, when I was young and I was in my 20s, I was reading all these stories about the white emigres, and I thought, of course, they hated Czechists, and there is no way these people could talk to each other. And all of a sudden, 20 years later, in the 2000s, you see Boris Jordan, as I said, a descendant of a very aristocratic family, praising Putin, who was never shy to say that he actually was very proud to serve in the KGB, which was a direct descendant of the CEKA, who killed all these aristocrats. And I could make my mind how you can do that. How can you justify these things? But it looks like for these people, the idea of a strong leader in the country is a very appealing idea, no matter what. It might be the Tsar, it might be Stalin, it might be Putin. The main thing that it's about a big, strong country with a really strong leader. That's enough.
I like your quotation from the famous Soviet dissident and political emigre Vladimir Bukovsky, who said that this is how the Russian Empire was built. The expansion of Russia was the result of a long process in which Russians fled from Russian power, and the power followed the people. And I think it's not just a figure of speech; it's more than that. But nowadays, 8 months after this war started in Ukraine, I think that the West is not so innocent anymore. So these Russians can be can influence again as before in their homelands, the United States and Western Europe as before.
Well, I think we have two interesting problems here. So one problem is that all of a sudden, the West took a lot of Russian recent immigrants, people who left the country because of the war. And we are talking about more than 100,000 people. So now there are different estimates. None of them are really accurate. So I would say very cautiously that it is about several 100,000 people. These people are extremely well educated. Not all of them openly anti-Putin, but none of them want to join the Russian army and to fight in Ukraine, which gives me some hope that at least these people do not want to fight. And also, they are, I think, potentially might be a really good thing for the Western countries, because, as I said, many of them are extremely well educated, and they just don't feel comfortable to stay in the country. Of course, we all know this emotional argument made by Vladimir Zelensky, who said that the Russians says, well, it's better to send them back, and that would cause a revolution. I'm quite skeptical that this could actually start a revolution. Well, the revolutions never start in this way. And obviously you cannot start a revolution from prison, and that's where you can find these people if you send them back. But nevertheless, I would say that it's still an opportunity. It's not a threat, but it is an opportunity. But you also have a different Russians already living in the West for many, many years. And we are talking of people who emigrated in the 1990s, some of them in the early 2000s, some of them in the 1980s. Many of them are surprisingly are very pro-Kremlin. And we see these people in Germany, we see these people in the Czech Republic, in the United States. These are the people who are going to these pro-Kremlin big rallies on the 9th of May, celebrating the Russian, as they say, victory in the Second World War, and they're having all these portraits and all that. The problem with these people is that they left Russia so many years ago that they completely forgot why they left the country. And what we got instead is a sense of the loss of a national identity. They are not completely in the West, and they are not in Russia anymore. We're in between. They still have, some of them still have some problems in the West. They do not feel like they have a place they deserve. And this crisis of national identity for them was extremely successfully exploited by the Kremlin, because that's exactly what the Kremlin is giving them, the sense of belonging to something really big. Like, well, if you live just in a small German town and you are immigrants from Russia many years ago, and you still have problems with your language skills, or your job is not that great as you aspired, and that's one image of you. It's completely another image of you if you think, well, I'm not just a guy living in this small town, but I am part of this big country which forced everybody to talk about. And you have the whole world thinking about what to do about Russia. That give you a gratifying feeling of belonging to something really big. Because in this case, you can tell something to your neighbors that actually you understand Putin, and you sort of, you can be bigger than you are in your everyday life. And that's that kind of feeling which is exploited by Putin even now. These people still have this problem with their identity, no matter what is happening in Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's not about rational arguments. It's all about emotions for these people. So they choose not to listen to all these reports about what is going on in Ukraine, how many people get killed, and all these atrocities. They just do not want to hear that, because they need to have a national identity, and they need to have this feeling of belonging to something really big.
Do you think that these communities are manipulated by Russia? And I'm thinking about the Lisa case in Germany 7 years ago. It was a huge scandal, also a diplomatic one. It's become one of the most important things that happened regarding the disinformation and how you can manipulate a community. So, having in mind that the Russian diaspora is the third largest in the world, 25 million people, do you think that the Russian secret services have the ability to manipulate these people in West?
They're obviously trying to, and they've been trying for many years, and I would say they never stopped. So right after the revolution, already in 1922, as far as I remember, there were some documents approved by the Stalin by Soviet secret services, direct orders to start working with the Russian immigration to promote the Russian goals, back then Soviet goals. And they created a very expensive networks of organizations already in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, obviously, and after the war. And we are talking about many things. We are talking about cultural initiatives, the movement for peace, exchanges, all kinds of activities which were disguised as civil activities. But actually, the KGB played a significant part in these activities. We still have the same organizations active even now. What Putin did, he invested even more in these activities. Because he understood this crisis of the national identity I described. So what he decided to do, he decided to create a big I would say, a new network of organizations under the umbrella of Россотрудничество, Russian Cooperation Agency, which is officially under control of the foreign ministry, but everybody knows that the presence of Russian spies is very, very high there. And what we can do, and what we are doing, obviously, is that now there are so many Russians abroad, and so many of them, as I said, went to these countries years ago, which means that not all, but many of them have passports, so they could vote. So they actually could influence the political situations in European countries, especially in countries with a really large percentage of the Russians, like Germany. And they are quite active politically. The other problem is that it looks like it was only Putin and his agencies who wanted to talk to these people. The Russian political immigration, Russian political organizations and exiles, were never extremely successful at talking to these people. And I remember that when we were researching this book, we spoke with Russian political opposition politicians who live in the United States and other countries. And we asked this question, like, why do you not talk to people in Berlin, in New York, and Brighton Beach, and all of that? And they were very, I would say, not cynical, but I would say the approach was very short-sighted. It just said, we don't see any sense talking to these people. To some extent, they despised them, which I think was a big mistake. So you have this very big Russian-speaking community, which was left without any guidance, without real media to talk to them. And all of a sudden, you got Putin and his media, who invested a lot of money into while creating a way to talk to them. So they became a very easy target for Putin's propaganda. And of course, they've been used and they're using now. They've been used now, yeah.
We know that the Russians tried to influence the elections in the United States 6 years ago, and in Germany and in France, and Brexit and the referendum for independence of Catalonia. We also know that the Russian secret services are to blame for attempt of assassination or assassination. Do you think that these things are still possible now, keeping in mind that the West is now supporting Ukraine? It's still possible to interfere in elections and have these active measures and so on and so on?
Well, I think, first of all, they're still, of course, very likely to happen, because what we see is when the Kremlin finds itself in a big crisis, and now it's a big crisis, it's an existential crisis for Russia, they tend to look at what was done by their Soviet predecessors. Putin is has such a big admiration for the KGB, so he always tried to learn something from the KGB practices. The KGB was not that successful, but it's a big myth for many people in Russian security services now, and they believe that the practices, the methods used by the KGB are really great to be replicated. So unfortunately, I think that many things we described in our book talking about the Cold War, like the assassinations, they unfortunately still are on the cards now, because that's the way they operate. That's the way they are trained to think about how to deal with a problem, with a threat, with a challenge, to kill people, to recruit them, and sometimes in a very brutal way, to spread fear. And we saw that when Skripal was poisoned, how effective it was, and how many people who already lived in the West became really scared. And I remember when we researched this book, and every conversation, literally every conversation with a Russian emigre, the question about Novichok was mentioned by them, not by me. So they took this message. They should be extremely careful. So that's how the Russian security services operate.
Just a moment, please. Why poison? Why also always poison and not something else, like in case of Boris Nemtsov assassination or Trotsky? Why always poison in the West?
It's not only about the West, by the way, because, for instance, Karamurza, Vladimir Karamurza, Russian politician in exile, was poisoned twice. Miraculously, he survived, and now he is in jail. Navalny was also poisoned in the country. Dmitry Bykov, a very famous Russian poet, was also poisoned in the country. He also survived. Both of them survived, thanks God. But
some other guys in Russia died falling from the window. So that I'm saying, why poison for these guys more important? Yeah.
It is a very interesting question. Why poison was and has been always actually on the cards. And Stalin security services started poisoning people back in the 1930s. I think it's something about a psychological effect poisoning has on people. Because if you just shoot people, like Nemtsov was killed, in this case, first of all, you cannot blame the victim, because you cannot say that Nemtsov killed himself. It's just, it's just nonsense. You also cannot, it's also something which just happened, and then you need to deal with the consequences of this horrible assassination. But when you poison someone, first of all, you always can blame the victim. And that's always is the case with the Russian security services. They always blame the victim. Like, no, nobody tried to poison Nemtsov. He poisoned himself because he was drunk. Nobody poisoned Karamurza. He was prone to get some medicine in combination with alcohol. So they always muddy the waters when we are talking about poisoning. And poisoning provides this opportunity. If people want and choose not to believe that somebody got poisoned, the poisoning gives this opportunity. You can always deny that it actually takes place. The other thing is, and I think it's even more horrible, is that the KGB has been working for years, developing special tactics, how to attack not only a troublemaker, but also his family and his friends. And that is why, for instance, the KGB has had these very extensive networks of regional departments. Like in Moscow, for instance, you have the central apparatus of the FSB. You have the Moscow departments of the FSB. And in every district, you have a special section of the FSB. Why? Why do you have so many people on the ground? The reason is that, for instance, if you have a guy, a politician, for instance, or an activist, and he became a target, the KGB in these days, the FSB, could use this network of regional departments to make lives really difficult for his kids in a school, in a kindergarten, for his wife in a hospital, and so on and so forth. So the idea is always to send a message: don't oppose the Kremlin, because it would be a problem not only for you, but also for your family and for your friends. Poisoning is something which gives you this opportunity, because usually poisoning takes some time, and as the target is dying, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, and it's a horrible experience his or her family is going through with the victim. And it has such a horrible psychological effect on everybody who is in touch and who actually is in the know. And these days, because we have social media, of course, it affects much more people. And I remember when Litvinenko was poisoned, that had a big effect on people in Moscow, because all these photographs and people talked about it. When before that, Yuri Shikachikhin, the very famous Russian journalist, was poisoned. Some of my colleagues, Russian journalists, told me that, well, it's better for them to leave the profession altogether, because they expected to be shot but not to be poisoned. It's such a horrible reality, which has this big psychological impact on people. And that is why it's, in a very cynical way, it's very effective.
We know a lot of things from you, especially about FSB. We know some things about the Foreign Intelligence Service and about the military one. But we know little about the so-called FSU, I think.
So, yeah.
The special unit that is protecting Putin. What is this one dealing with?
Well, first of all, Putin has not just one, but two agencies protecting him personally. So you have the FSO, Федеральная служба охраны, Federal Protective Service, and inside of this agency, you have another agency, SBP, Служба безопасности президента, the Service of Protection of the President. These two agencies are in charge of providing protection, personal protection to Putin, and it reflects how paranoid he is. And interesting thing that the powers of these agencies are not extremely clear. So they are not, we know that they are not only about protecting Putin, but sometimes they are also in charge of reporting to Putin about something happening in the country, bypassing the usual ways of reporting to him used by other security agencies. So to some extent, it is a competition to the FSB. But I would say it's very murky. And sometimes Putin, just doesn't want to make it very clear where are the limits of the powers of these agencies. What we know now is Putin is getting more and more, well, we knew that for many years that he was very paranoid, but now he is thinking that if he wants to find a new candidate for some high-level position, he cannot rely on people he doesn't know personally. And that means he started appointing to these high positions people who used to be his bodyguards, which is not extremely effective. I mean, these bodyguards might be good to, in protecting people, but they don't have any skills at like governing big regions of Russia. And we have several examples of these people.
The case of Soldatov?
Well, Soldatov is, but at least he has maybe some experience. Because he has been around for so long. But we have some other people, like Dumin, for instance, who is the governor of Tula, which is a big region, and with a very heavy presence of the Russian military-industrial complex there. And his experience in governance is extremely limited.
You know, everybody it's wondering if Putin himself was the target of disinformation done by the people who he trusts mostly, because after the annexation of Crimea, after something like a blitzkrieg, he expected Ukrainian people to meet the Russian army with flowers. And then something happened. So do you think that Putin was disinformed? I mean, there are people around him and he trusts maybe less than the fingers at one hand. So let's say Patrushev, Naryshkin, Shoigu, let's say maybe Prigozhin or Kadyrov.
Bortnikov, yeah.
Bortnikov. And now do you think that Putin trusts anyone around him? Or he decide by his own will and head to what to do?
Well, of course, he has no choice but to rely on information provided by these people, because he doesn't have any alternative, I would say, sources of information. I mean, the independent media are killed in the country. He doesn't, of course, trust foreign media, so he would never read the New York Times if he wants to understand what is going on in Ukraine. So the only means he has is his intelligence reports provided by his spies. He might be critical or not critical, but still he is, just by definition, he is a victim of the limits if you build this kind of system of informing of a leader. But I would say it would be too far to say that he was a victim of disinformation. What the FSB did, and the FSB was in charge of providing political information about the situation in Ukraine. And the FSB has been in charge of that for years, actually starting in the early 2000s. Of course, now we see that it was a gross miscalculation, a massive miscalculation, the idea that Ukraine would immediately collapse. But it's quite interesting why they got it so wrong. It's not like they reported all facts wrong. No, it was not like that. The problem was that people inside of the FSB, they have a very cynical view of things, and they had a very cynical, dark view of Ukraine as a state. For instance, they believed, and what they reported to Putin, that Ukraine had a big problem of corruption. And to be honest, it was quite correct. But they reported only this part of the big picture. So the only thing they actually reported to Putin was the message that, look, this country cannot survive because politicians and the government officials in this country are corrupt, easily manipulated. We can bribe them. And then they make this big assumption. And that meant for them that the country would collapse immediately, that it's a failed state, not a real state. And it is here where we made a big mistake, because the problem of the FSB, they always disregarded the grass movements and civil society. They always underestimated these things in the country like Russia, but also in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the civil society is much stronger than in Russia. And if you take it out of the question, and if you report to your leader only the problems of corruption inside of the state apparatus of Ukraine, you would get some sort of information, and it would be to some extent true, but in a big sense, it would be absolutely false. And that's exactly what happened to Putin. So he believed in these reports that Ukrainian politicians were corrupt or easily manipulated. And that's it. He never believed, and also, of course, he despised Zelensky personally. He never believed that Zelensky would stay in Kiev and he would decide to stay and to fight. So these mistakes cost him dearly.
You reported about this General Sergei Beseda, the head of FSB Fifth Service, was placed under house arrest over early failures following the invasion. It was world-breaking news, and you were the source of that. Why do you think that these sources from FSB told you about Beseda? I mean, it's a war. They are risking something for telling you this kind of things?
Well, first of all, it's been my, I would say, personal quest to report about the Fifth Service of the FSB, which is a foreign intelligence branch of the FSB, for many years. I started doing that back in 2002. Oh yeah, 20 years by now. And so I got some of the sources inside of this particular department back then, in the early 2000s. So some of these people are obviously retired, some of these people are still there, but it means that I still can talk to these people and they trust me. And it's quite interesting that even in the time of war, personal trust matters more than, say, all this talks about the war and all of that. The other thing is that in the beginning of the war, there were so many people who were unhappy of the way the war was and the crisis was unfolding. And these people were unhappy in the other agencies, like the military intelligence, but also inside of the FSB. These people we had this urge to talk to journalists, to share their concerns about how things started and how they were going. So all of a sudden, you got such a big crisis that lots of people inside of the security services felt very uneasy. I would say now it's changing, unfortunately. Unfortunately for everybody, because now you have people inside who found a way how to adjust to this new reality of war. So there is a big feeling of acceptance. Nobody now asks why Putin started the war. Like it is, now they feel and they talk about it as something which was completely inevitable. Like, well, yeah, maybe he would needed to start it like maybe a month later, a month earlier. But they actually believed in this theory that NATO would attack or something like that. I mean, the main point is that actually they believe now that it was inevitable, and they agreed with that. They accepted this. So I would say that now support enjoyed by Putin inside of the security services is quite strong. But there are some still interesting things which are going on. This guy Beseda, actually, in a very interesting turn of events, he was released. Maybe because of this scandal, and Putin did want to show the world that something is not going according to his plan, as it famously was said. So yeah, in a very Stalinist way of doing things, he released Beseda and he made it public. Like he said, like, you told us that this guy was in jail. No, he's still here with me. And it is quite interesting because, again, it reflects the new reality that Putin's Russia is getting more and more, I would say, like Stalin's Russia, unfortunately. So many, it's not like, of course, we are not talking about mass repression, so it's not about the Gulag, but the methods used by the Kremlin and the methods used by the security services are getting more and more similar to what we saw back in the 1940s and 1950s.
For that reason, because you exposed Putin's purges of spy agency blamed for failings in Ukraine, Russia puts you on the wanted list. So you were charged with spreading of disinformation about the military. Now you live in exile, so you are part of the community you talk about in this book. In October, it has to be a trial in absentia. What can happen for you and Irina?
Well, I got a note from the investigator that the criminal investigation was prolonged until January. And it's quite interesting because we expected, well, I would say even in the summer, there was some news and some rumors that my case might be the first case of someone trying in absentia, and they wanted to make it a big story. For some reason, they changed their mind, and it was delayed until October, now until January. Well, it's of course it's still a problem, because it means that I'm still on this wanted list. And because there is no trial, there is no way to do anything about the case. So I still have my assets frozen, I still have my car and the rest, and I cannot travel to certain countries because I could be sent to Russia. So yeah, it is still a kind of problem for both of us. what is interesting about our case, and we have now many cases against Russian journalists, like every day someone else added to this wanted list, literally, if not every day, but every week. My case, maybe just my attitude to this and trying to look at this professionally, but my case is quite interesting because we know that the case was started not because I spread some news about the military, but because of this story about Beseda. Because we got a copy of the very first report which started the case, and this very first report was from the department of the FSB, and it clearly said that, look, because we published this story, we need to do something about them. So it would be quite interesting, professionally speaking, to watch how my case would be investigated and tried, because it would give some rare glimpse into how the FSB are changing their methods and what they're going to do. So maybe it would give me an idea about the next chapter for the updated edition, maybe.
Maybe it's interesting to know why these guys from the Russian secret services are doing their job. So there is no ideology still. If you said that there is a perfect continuity in the last century from CEKA and KGB to this present secret services. But do you think that these guys really believe in Russia messianic role in the world, about what Putin said, the third Rome, and so on, or they are just pragmatic?
Well, we have some idea, some sort of ideology, I would say. It's very far from what we say in public. In public, it's all about Russian being a grand and a great country and global affairs and all that. But deep inside, the interesting thing about the people inside of the security services is almost all of them who think, many of these people, they just don't think, but people who think, they share this feeling of insecurity. They actually believe that Russia is a very weak country, very weak. And they believe that just like as they believe Ukraine is corrupted, Russia is much more corrupt. And that is why they believe that even a small thing, like a small street protest, like 5 people, is capable to start a revolution, a new revolution in Russia, and destroy everything. They have this apocalyptic view that the new revolution is quite imminent, and again could destroy everything. And to prevent this revolution from happening, they could do whatever they want, to kill people, to assassinate them, to poison them, to attack people on the streets. Because sometimes you ask them, like, why do you think it's legitimate and it's needed to say to ban completely any protest activities on the streets? I mean, sometimes you have like how many people? Thousands of people, sometimes hundreds of people. Is it really a threat? And the usual response, you never know what could start a revolution. And again, this feeling of insecurity is, you can trace it back to the Soviet past, because they actually do not know how the revolution of 1917 started. They actually believed in
a revolution, if it was a revolution, yeah.
Yeah, and actually they believed in this idea that, look, Lenin with a bunch of exiles just was brought by Germans to Petrograd, and they overthrew the Tsar, which of course very far from the reality, because you had, first of all, you had the First World War and destroyed not 1 but 4 European empires, and Russia was just one of them. So they kind of miss this contact, this context, and they are focused only on Lenin and his friends. And that makes them feel very insecure. And the same thing happened, as they believe, in 1991. They do not understand how the Soviet Union collapsed. Just look from their point of view, it looks like that. You had a big country, like a real competition to everybody, including the United States. This country had the biggest and the most intelligent security agency in the world, I mean the KGB. And all of a sudden, it collapsed in 3 days. So you need to find an explanation, and they have none. And that is why they believe that even a small protest and some small level activity might start a new revolution. And that is why they are so paranoid.
And finally, the last question. Some would say that every state has a mafia, but Russia is the only state where mafia has a state. Some will say that Russia is the only state, or is the first time in Russia's history when the state is run by the secret services. And Putin, of course, is a former one officer. Now the West think that if Putin is gone, Russia will turn to democracy. Do you think it's a correct presumption? Putin is the only problem now for this system?
No, of course not. Of course not. I mean, we have more than 80% of people being still supportive of the war in Ukraine. So unfortunately, it's not only about Putin. We have, unfortunately, what Putin did with the Russian society, he completely corrupted it. Not in a way that people became cynical, but in a way that he made them complicit in his crimes. And it's not a secret that Russian teachers and schools were complicit at rigging elections, because we have our elections in schools, and our teachers were asked for many years to help to play with the results of the elections, and they helped a lot. We also have not only the military, but we have local governments, like city governments, being involved at suppressing activities of people who are protesting on the streets. And that makes a large part of the population being an active supporter, and sometimes an active part of the repressive apparatus Putin built. So I would say that even with Putin's gone, we still will have such a big problem in Russian society. And it is something which makes me extremely sad, because I was 15 years old when the Soviet Union collapsed. And I remember that back then, people were, especially in Moscow, of course I lived in Moscow, people were extremely optimistic and enthusiastic about the change, because they believed that what was needed was just to get rid of the Communist Party and the KGB, maybe. That's it. Now we understand that it's not enough. We just need to think that it's not only about Putin, and it's not only about the FSB, not only about the military. It's about so many things. So many things should be reformed. And to be honest, it's a big question for everybody, even where to start.
Andrei Soldatov, thank you so much.
Thank you.